When a seasoned TV host set out to corner Melania Trump with sharp questions, he was confident in his strategy, expecting just another headline-making moment. But what unfolded in that studio was something no one saw coming, a response so powerful that it turned the entire conversation on its head. Studio lights beamed down, casting a warm yet unforgiving glow on the sleek stage. The audience sat in eager anticipation, some leaning forward in their seats, waiting for the moment the host would strike. Cameras were set rolling, capturing every glance, every movement. The host adjusted his tie, his expression calm, yet calculated. This was his domain, a place where he dictated the narrative, but across from him sat Melania Trump, poised, elegant, and unreadable. There was something different about her. Tonight, a quiet confidence that hinted she wasn't here to simply answer questions, she was here to redefine them. The interview started like any other, a polite greeting, a few expected questions about initiatives and public service. The host smiled, his voice smooth and measured as he steered the conversation with ease. To anyone watching, it seemed like a standard discussion, but beneath that practiced charm was something more, a carefully laid plan disguised as casual curiosity. His approach was subtle, at first keeping the tone friendly, but his words carried an undertone, a hint of something more calculated. Every question was designed not just to probe, but to corner, to create a moment where Melania would stumble, where her responses could be twisted into headlines. He wanted controversy, not conversation, drama, not dialogue, and he was certain he would get it. He leaned in slightly, his expression shifting ever so subtly. His words grew bolder, now weaving skepticism into the conversation. He brought up criticisms about her initiatives, her role in the White House, even her marriage. But Melania sat unfazed, her demeanor calm, her eyes sharp. She recognized the game being played, and she was not about to be outmaneuvered. The audience began to sense it too. The host was pushing, leading, trying to create a moment that could go viral. But what he didn't realize was that he was the one walking into a trap, one that Melania had no need to set, because she had come prepared not with defensiveness, but with something far more powerful: unwavering grace and undeniable strength. Despite the host's carefully laid traps, Melania Trump remained composed, poised, with an air of quiet confidence that made it clear she was not someone easily rattled. Every question that carried a hidden jab, every attempt to push her into a defensive stance was met not with hesitation, but with calm, calculated responses. It was as if she had already anticipated each move before it even happened. Her expression never wavered, her smile remained subtle but firm, her posture graceful yet commanding. She listened intently, never interrupting, never rushing to defend herself. Instead, she chose her words with precision, her tone steady, measured, not a hint of frustration or uncertainty. No matter how direct or intrusive the host's questions became, she refused to let him dictate the tempo of the conversation. This wasn't a battle of words for her. It was a quiet dismantling of the very tactics being used against her. While the host leaned forward, pressing with more urgency, Melania remained still, her silence between answers deliberate, powerful, unsettling. In its own way, it was a confidence that did not need to prove itself, and that was precisely what began to shift the energy in a room. The audience could feel it, the host could feel it. What was supposed to be an easy takedown was slipping from his control. Melania was not reacting the way he had expected. She was not flustered, not defensive. Instead, she was turning the moment into something else, something he had not prepared for. And the more she remained unshaken, the more it became clear that this was not just an interview, it was a masterclass in composure under pressure. The air in the studio shifted ever so slightly, a subtle, almost imperceptible tension that even the audience could feel. The host had been pushing the limits with carefully framed questions, trying to steer the conversation in a way that would trap Melania. But so far, every attempt had been met with unwavering composure. He needed something bigger, something that would throw her off balance. And that's when he decided to take a different approach. Leaning forward ever so slightly, he smirked, as if he was about to deliver the knockout blow, the line that would finally make headlines. He tilted his head, and with a carefully measured casualness, let the words slip out, "You are still hot." The silence that followed was deafening, a moment of suspended anticipation as the words hung in the air. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Some gasped, others exchanged uneasy glances, while a few chuckled nervously. But all eyes were on Melania, waiting to see how she would react. The host reclined slightly back in his chair, convinced that he had finally broken through the wall of her poise, that this was the moment she would falter. But she didn't. Melania's expression remained unreadable, her eyes held steady, and instead of flinching or showing even the slightest sign of discomfort, she let the pause linger for just a moment longer, just enough for the weight of his words to settle around the room. Then, in a tone as smooth as glass, she responded, "Thank you, but let's keep this professional, shall we?" It was not a reaction of shock or offense, nor was it one of anger. Instead, it was a masterful redirection, a subtle yet undeniable assertion of power. In just a few words, she had managed to flip the moment on its head, making it clear that she would not be reduced to a flippant remark or allow herself to be objectified in a conversation meant to be about far more than appearances. The host blinked, taken aback for the first time. That evening, it was clear he had not expected this. He had expected a nervous laugh, an awkward deflection, or even a hint of irritation, but Melania had given him nothing to grasp onto. Her response was firm, yet elegant, dismissive, yet controlled, and in that instant it became clear that he had miscalculated. The audience picked up on it too. There was a shift in energy, a recognition that the host's attempt to undermine her had not only failed, but had backfired spectacularly. Instead of making her uncomfortable, he had only made himself look desperate, as if he had run out of meaningful points to challenge her on. Melania took a slow, composed breath, adjusting her posture ever so slightly as she continued speaking, as if nothing had happened, seamlessly pulling the conversation back to the topic at hand. And in that moment, it was no longer just an interview. It was a lesson in grace, in composure, in never allowing someone else to dictate the narrative, no matter how hard they tried. The studio was still buzzing from the host's previous remark, but Melania Trump remained unfazed. Where others might have stuttered or hesitated, she simply exhaled slowly, her poised expression unshaken, her presence commanding the air around her, shifted, an almost invisible force of quiet confidence radiating from her as she prepared to deliver a response that no one was expecting. The host still carried the faintest trace of a smirk, convinced that he had successfully set the stage for an awkward moment. But as Melania finally spoke, his confidence visibly cracked. Her voice was steady, measured, firm, yet undeniably elegant. "It is fascinating," she said softly, yet with unmistakable sharpness, "how often strong women are reduced to their appearance, as if their worth, their intelligence, their contributions to the world are somehow secondary to how they look." She tilted her head slightly, the weight of her words hanging in the air. "And yet those same people claim to support women's empowerment. Isn't that interesting?" The audience stilled. The host's smirk wavered for the first time in the entire interview. It was clear that the dynamic had shifted. She had not only deflected his attempt to corner her, she had turned it into a statement that forced reflection on everyone in the room. The elegance of her words was in their simplicity. She did not need to raise her voice, did not need to be aggressive. She had simply exposed the hypocrisy beneath his question, and now he had nowhere to hide. He cleared his throat, shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping against the armrest. He tried to regain control, but Melania was not finished. Her gaze never left his as she continued, "You see, women who think for themselves, who make their own choices, who refuse to be boxed into a narrative that does not serve them, are often met with these kinds of questions, these subtle attempts to undermine them." She let the moment breathe, let the weight of her words settle in before adding, "But I am not here to fit into anyone's expectations. I am here because I have earned my place, and I will not apologize for that." The audience shifted, then a murmur rippled through the room, not of discomfort, but of admiration. Spontaneous applause began hesitantly at first, then grew stronger, even from those who had initially been skeptical of her presence. The host was visibly unsettled. This was not the reaction he had anticipated. His attempts to regain the upper hand were slipping through his fingers. The audience was no longer on his side. He had tried to shape the conversation, but Melania had rewritten it entirely. He fumbled for his next words, trying to mask his discomfort, but there was no coming back from this moment. She had taken his strategy, his tactics, his subtle attempts at undermining her, and flipped them into something undeniable, a message so powerful that it could not be ignored. Melania simply smiled slightly and waited, unbothered, unapologetic, completely in control. The host could feel the shift in the room. What was once his domain, his stage, his moment to shine, was slipping away. Melania Trump had not only dismantled his attempts to corner her, she had done so with such effortless grace that the audience was no longer on his side. He needed to regain control. He needed to redirect the conversation in a way that would restore his authority, but every attempt felt weaker, less impactful, drowned out by the silent but undeniable energy shift in the studio. He forced a chuckle, sitting up straighter, his hands folding together, as if he was still the one leading the discussion. His voice carried an artificial smoothness as he spoke again. Well, that's certainly an interesting perspective, but let's be honest, you must be aware of how people perceive your marriage. The public has questioned it for years. Isn't it fair to say that this is a topic worth discussing? Melania remained still, her expression unreadable. Then she responded with something even more dangerous than anger. She responded with amusement, a slow, soft smile that barely reached her eyes as she tilted her head ever so slightly, as if she was studying him, as if she was deciding whether his question was even worth acknowledging. People will always have opinions, but opinions are not facts, and I do not waste my time on speculation. The host faltered, his practiced confidence cracking ever so slightly. He glanced at his notes, as if searching for another angle, something he could use to regain control, but he found nothing. Meanwhile, the audience had already made their decision. Subtle nods exchanged among them, a few hushed murmurs, some leaning forward in their seats, waiting to see how much further he would go. He tried again, his voice carrying a forced casualness, but surely you can understand why people question the dynamic, especially considering the power and influence involved. Melania's expression didn't change, but her voice carried a sharpened edge. Now, power and influence are interesting concepts, she said slowly, deliberately, because true power does not come from wealth or status. It comes from character, from integrity, from standing firm, even when people try to reduce you to a narrative that suits their own agenda. Another ripple through the audience, an energy that had fully shifted away from the host. This was no longer his interview to control. It was hers, and he knew it. He cleared his throat, adjusting in his seat. One last attempt, one last push. So you don't believe the public has a right to question these things? Melania let the silence stretch just long enough for it to become uncomfortable. Then she leaned forward ever so slightly. I believe the public is intelligent enough to see the difference between truth and manufactured controversy. The audience erupted in applause. The host sat back, deflated, no longer in charge of the moment, and he knew he had lost. The host had played every card in his deck, but nothing had worked. Melania Trump had met every attempt to unsettle her with grace and composure, turning each question back on him in a way he never anticipated. He needed something bigger, something that would shake her, something that would put him back in control. So he leaned and smirked just slightly, and with a voice dripping with false charm, dropped the question that stunned the room. Why won't you leave Donald Trump for a younger man like me? Gasps echoed through the studio. Audience members exchanged shocked glances, some shifting in their seats, others staring wide-eyed at the sheer audacity of the question. The host sat back, as if he had just delivered a masterstroke, a moment so outrageous it would guarantee headlines. It was a desperate gamble, and everyone could feel it. But Melania did not flinch. She did not frown or appear rattled. She simply tilted her head slightly, as if analyzing the question, as if deciding whether it was even worth responding to. And then she smiled, not a forced smile, not an awkward deflection, but a slow, knowing smile that made it clear the host had just made a grave mistake. Because, Mr. Host, she said, her voice smooth, calm, with an unmistakable edge. Unlike some people, I do not measure a man's worth by his age. I measure it by his character, his integrity, and his strength. And by those measures, Donald Trump is unmatched. Silence followed, thick, heavy. The host's smirk wavered, his confidence visibly cracking as the audience erupted in applause. Some even standing. The moment that was meant to shake Melania had instead shattered his own credibility, and in that instant he knew he had lost completely. The studio was still buzzing from the host's last desperate question, but Melania Trump remained as composed as ever. She had spent the entire interview dismantling every trap, every leading remark, and every attempt to box her into a narrative. But now the moment had come for her final blow, the moment that would leave no room for doubt, no space for misinterpretation. She let the applause settle, let the weight of her last words hang in the air. Then she leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto the host with an intensity that made him visibly uneasy. The smirk he had worn so confidently at the beginning of the interview was gone, replaced with something else, something resembling regret. "You see," she said smoothly, her voice unwavering. "People like you believe a woman's choices must always be explained, justified, or defended, but real strength, real independence, is not seeking validation from those who will never understand." The audience was silent, hanging onto every word. She took a slow breath, allowing the moment to stretch just long enough before delivering the final line that would be replayed for years to come. "I did not marry Donald Trump for money, just as I would never leave him for youth. I married a man, not a bank account, not an age, not a title, and certainly not for the approval of those who will never know what true commitment means." The words cut through the air like a final note in a symphony, sharp, undeniable, absolute. The host opened his mouth as if to respond, but nothing came out. He had lost control of the conversation long ago, and now he had lost the entire room. The audience erupted, not just in applause, but in something deeper, a realization that they had just witnessed something rare, a moment of pure, unshakable confidence, a woman who refused to be defined by anyone's expectations. The host sat back, eyes darting across the studio, scrambling for words, but there were none to be found because the interview was over and Melania Trump had won. As the cameras continued rolling, the host sat in stunned silence. His carefully crafted plan had collapsed before his eyes. What was meant to be a takedown had turned into a lesson, and he was the one being schooled. The audience could feel it too. This was not just an interview. It was a reckoning, a moment that had stripped away every assumption, every attempt to control the narrative, and left only the undeniable truth. Melania Trump had not just answered his questions, she had flipped them on their head. She had taken every attempt to corner her and turned it into an opportunity to assert her strength, her intelligence, and her unwavering poise. She had done what so few could do. She had made an experienced television host, the master of the gotcha moment, look completely powerless on his own stage. The energy in the studio had shifted entirely. What had started as an audience ready to see Melania put under pressure had transformed into a room full of admiration. Even those who had walked in skeptical, those who had expected rehearsed answers or diplomatic dodges, were now nodding along with respect, some even on their feet, applauding not just her words, but the sheer control with which she had commanded the entire situation. The host attempted one last time to salvage his position, clearing his throat as he fumbled for a wrap-up. But the damage was done. His voice lacked the smug confidence he had started with. And as he thanked Melania for coming, his eyes avoided hers. He had been outmaneuvered, and he knew it. As Melania rose from her seat, she didn't need to gloat. She didn't need a parting shot. Her mere presence, her unshaken confidence, was victory enough. She walked off the stage the same way she had walked on, with grace, with certainty, with the quiet power of a woman who knew exactly who she was and exactly how to handle the spotlight. The host watched her go, knowing that this interview, the one he had planned to be his moment of triumph, would instead be remembered as the moment he learned a lesson he would never forget.